My guest today is Professor Robert George, who's Professor of Jurisprudence and the Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's a specialist in moral and political philosophy, constitutional law, bioethics, and the theory of conscience. Welcome, Robert.
It's good to be on with you, Gil. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So you sent me a couple of papers on articles, and we'll start with them. But all these topics that you sort of think about are of great interest to me. I know nothing about them, um, but they're of great interest. So I'm hoping that we can, sort of go into that, and I can learn some aspects of those also. So I want to start with one of the papers. It's entitled "The Truth-Seeking Mission of the University and Its Conditions." And you say here, colleges and universities that are dedicated to liberal arts ideals have three fundamental purposes: the pursuit, preservation, and transmission of knowledge. Of course, there are other desirable ends that these institutions and the schools that feed children's, or sorry, I should say students, and the schools that feed students into them legitimately seek to achieve, but those are their fundamental and defining purposes. You say here other things that such institutions do in the arts, for example, or in the professional training, athletics, and the like, are in a sense founded upon them. And anything they do that undermines these purposes, which is, I should say, pursuit, preservation, and transmission of knowledge, they should not be doing. So I have a little bit of a funny story for you, Robert, to start with. So I went to graduate school in India, and I went to a school that is basically just teaches engineering.
Oh, yes.
And so for 5 years, I learned physics, chemistry, and engineering. I had one class in economics, one class in psychology, and it's a 5 year long stretch into engineering. It has a pretty low admission rate, so it's all based on one exam that people take. And typically, we don't get anybody who can hit a ball with a bat. So there is no sports or athletics. So is this really what you want to accomplish? A very focused education?
I'm sorry, Gil, I did not understand the
Yeah, so
question. I
is
understood
this,
your
is sort
background
of
and the sort of engineering program in which you were educated. And 5 years sounds like a very long haul.
long
And it
haul for
sounds like
engineering?
the
But when
university,
I look at what you've written, the pursuit, preservation, and transmission of knowledge
yes.
is all this university is worried about. They're not worried about anything else at all.
Oh, I see. I see. Yeah.
So is that a good outcome?
It's fine. It's fine. I don't mind universities doing other things as well, such as athletics, up to the point at which the focus on athletics begins to harm, to detract from, to damage the fundamental and justifying mission of the university, which
Hmm.
is the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of knowledge, the advancement of understanding, the transmission of knowledge, the preservation of knowledge. So we have in the United States some colleges and universities that are now so single-mindedly focused on athletics
Hmm. Yeah.
that the educational mission is pushed to the side. This is the matter to which I object.
Hmm.
I do not object to having athletics. I think athletics can make a good contribution to the overall program of the university, but
Yeah.
it has to be kept in its proper place, and it
Hmm.
must never be permitted to interfere with or undermine the scholarly mission of the university. That's my only point.
Yeah, it's interesting, Robert. So I went to for graduate studies in engineering. I went to Northwestern,
Mhm.
and this is a school that provides that gives I should say PTSD to people who go there because they try to compete in athletics and they often get beaten up by universities that are really focused on athletics. So they're sort of trying to do a little bit of that and a little bit of this. That's also a problem, isn't it?
Oh, yes, that's right. I mean, if you're going to have an athletics program, I think it's important that you compete at the level at which your students are actually competitive and can sometimes win. Otherwise, it becomes demoralizing. So, if you have a situation like you have at Northwestern, where, as I understand it, you're competing with some of the great athletic programs of the Midwestern state universities, well, it's going to be hard to ever field a winning team, and that can be demoralizing. So I think it's better to be part of a league where, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but your teams are competitive and your students are competitive with the student athletes at the institutions that are your opponents.
So I want to understand. So liberal education, I didn't really go through it, as I mentioned briefly, Robert. So I went to schools, undergraduate school in India, and it's a very, very different situation. So the liberal education, as we say here, how do you define that? What are sort of the parameters in that definition?
Yes, a liberal education, as I use the term, means an education that directs students' attention to the pursuit of knowledge in subjects where the knowledge is desirable not simply as means to other ends, but for its own sake. If we make the elementary distinction between instrumental value and intrinsic value, a liberal arts education puts the emphasis on topics the study of which, the knowledge of which, is of intrinsic value. So, English literature, history, philosophy, um, economics, political science, sociology, chemistry, biology, physics. Our knowledge in these fields may, in addition to its intrinsic value, have instrumental value of various sorts, but the value is not reducible simply to the instrumental value. These are subjects that are worth exploring, deepening our understanding of, for its own sake, for the intrinsic value of the knowledge. So I'm not concerned, quite the opposite, if a student wants to study a subject matter that's not going to lead necessarily to a job or a better job,
Yeah.
or to social advancement or influence or prestige or power. I'm most interested in the students studying subjects that are worth studying for their own sake, that intrigue the student, that capture the student's interest and imagination, deepening the student as a human being, not
Yeah.
necessarily making him a better banker at Goldman Sachs or a better lawyer at Cravath, Swaine and Moore, or a better engineer or a better computer scientist. All those are good things. All those are fine. But I want the focus to be on the student learning for the sake of the knowledge itself. And that's what a liberal education is all about.
Yeah. So would you say this is like a grand idea? Um, do you have to be a developed country before we can actually accomplish something like that? Yeah, as you know, in a developing country, you're basically trying to get to a job,
Yeah.
and you are basically forced into medicine or engineering or something like that, because that's the only way you're going to get a job
Yeah.
situation. So is this sort of a developed country idea? And I want to ask you, sort of along with it, when did the US get to this process of liberal education?
Well, as I understand the history of liberal education, it takes us back a long time. In the West, certainly to Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greece. Plato's Academy was an institution of liberal education, asking students to consider questions and debate questions not because of their applicability to the particular issues and problems of politics or economics or society of the day, but issues about what it means to be a human being, what it means to live a human life. There is a certain sense in which being able to focus on those issues is a luxury.
Hmm.
If you are preoccupied every moment with where your next meal is going to come from,
Yeah.
or you're preoccupied with the threat of invasion or attack or crime, well, you're not going to have the time or the mental resources to focus on questions of the meaning of life.
Mm,
But I think that's among the reasons it's important to develop, at least to the point where people have the opportunity
mm,
to reflect on these questions of meaning and value, what are sometimes called the great existential questions. So
mm.
I think in developing countries, my own advice would be not to treat the problem as one of either or. Either you
Yeah.
focus on technical education or you focus on liberal arts education. I think you can do both at the same time.
Mm,
I would hope that even in um, universities that are mainly focused on technical education, such as great engineering and science universities or STEM universities, there would still be some opportunities for students there to engage the questions of meaning and value, the questions that are addressed in literature, in history, in philosophy, in political theory, these kinds of questions. I
Yeah.
don't think that it hurts anybody. In fact, I think it helps anybody, even a student who is training for a technical field. And it could be law as well as engineering, it could be economics, whatever it is,
Mm,
to also spend some time, some of his intellectual life, wrestling with the questions of meaning and value.
yeah. It's a bit of a catch-22 in the sense that, um, as you say, it might be a luxury good, yeah, when you're resource constrained. But if you don't have that luxury good, you cannot really break out of, as they call the rat race in some
Yeah.
ways. And so this is sort of a societal design question in many ways, which is you have to sort of forcibly break out of the rat race to get enlightened, so to speak.
Well, yeah, there's
Yeah.
some truth in that, I think, Gil. Even if we're focusing in our own lives or in our institutional lives in this or that university on technical education, we still at some point need to ask ourselves questions about why we are doing this,
Mm,
what the value of it is, what resources should be devoted to these technical issues, and what resources should be devoted to other sorts of issues. In all fields, certainly in all technical fields, there are profound ethical questions that arise. Look at questions of economics, look at questions of biotechnology,
yeah.
questions of law. We can treat these as technical subjects, and to a very considerable extent they are. And yet, there are questions that arise in the practice of these disciplines, in the practice of these professions, that cannot be addressed simply by technical inquiry, that can only be addressed by what I call liberal arts inquiry, looking for practical knowledge, prudential wisdom, ethical judgment. So we need to give our young men and women, as we're educating them, some opportunities to enrich their thinking on the non-technical questions, or at least learn how to begin to address those questions when they come up, as inevitably they will.
Mm. So truth seeking, as you say in the paper, it sounds like a fundamental mission of a university, but oftentimes it's not quite true, right? It seems biased in one way or the other. Whatever the university is trying to pursue, you have to sort of fall in line. A university appears like a corporation, a profit maximizing corporation with certain objectives.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was recently a critique of my own university, Princeton University, that accused us of being a hedge fund with a school attached to it. Uh, that, of course, is a reference to the large endowment that Princeton and a small handful of other universities and colleges in the United States have. Most universities are not wealthy, in the United States at least. Most universities are not wealthy. Most universities do not have big endowments. They rely on student enrollments and the fees that students pay to enroll in the universities. But there is a handful, Princeton is one, that are very wealthy. And then, of course, that raises the question, what do we do with that wealth? How do we
Hmm.
use that in the best possible way to advance the mission of the university, which I continue to want to insist is a mission of truth seeking, the pursuit and the preservation and the transmission of knowledge. I don't want us to be simply another big corporation. And if we're going to pursue knowledge, it seems to me we have to do it in an open-minded way that is not doctrinaire. Just the recognition of our own fallibility as human beings. And this is everybody on earth. It certainly includes professors. It certainly includes Ivy League professors. It certainly includes Princeton professors. It certainly includes me. Every single person is fallible. We can be wrong about things, and we know we are wrong about certain things. The trouble is we don't know which ones they are.
Yeah.
But the only way we're going to get from error to truth, move from error to truth, or deepen our understanding of truth to the extent that we have it, is by open inquiry. By open inquiry, I mean not only inquiry that is not forbidden by external powers, but inquiry in which we are self-critical enough to subject our own thinking to scrutiny, to intellectual scrutiny, to consider other possibilities, consider points of view that we don't hold, consider them on the merits, make a judgment, an objective judgment as to whether they are superior to the views we happen to hold. Now, we all have the experience of having changed our minds about some things. Most people have the experience of having changed their minds on some very important things.
Yeah.
Well, that in itself should tell us that it's a good thing to avoid being doctrinaire, for universities to avoid becoming institutions of indoctrination and propaganda. I think what you were referring to earlier, Gill, is a real problem. Too many universities have allowed themselves to become centers of propaganda, where a particular point of view or a small range of points of view are given dominance, and other points of view or points of view that challenge the prevailing points of view are excluded, systematically excluded, and sometimes even punished if they're expressed. And that undermines the basic mission of the university as a truth-seeking institution.
Is it because the money, the endowments, as you say, come with strings attached?
No, I
Okay.
don't think so. I don't see that as the fundamental problem. That is sometimes an issue. There's no question about that. And universities, if they are conducting their affairs properly, will not accept gifts with strings attached if the strings constrain inquiry, if the strings require that a certain conclusion be drawn or reached, or that a certain point of view be given hegemony and other points of view excluded. Universities should never take that money. Sometimes they do, but they're wrong when they do that. But I don't see that as the fundamental problem. I see the fundamental problem being the emergence of an orthodoxy on campus, because in universities, the current faculty decide who the future faculty will be. And we frail, fallible, fallen human beings tend to want to appoint to faculty positions as our successors or as our colleagues, people who think as we think.
Yeah.
And it's hard to resist that temptation. But if we are to be faithful to the mission, the truth-seeking mission of the university, we have to resist that temptation. We have to be willing to recognize good work and reward it, and be willing to hire people who represent that good work, who have done that good work, even if that work challenges conclusions that we hold and even hold dear. We have to be willing to accept as colleagues and certainly as students, people whose own beliefs challenge at a very fundamental level our most cherished beliefs, our most deeply held beliefs, our identity forming beliefs. But as I say, it's hard to do. So I can understand people's failure to do it. I can understand how the university can fall into the grip of an orthodoxy or a set of narrow doctrines. But we need to take the measure of the problem and do something about it.
Yeah, so it sounds like, Robert, to me, correct me if I'm wrong, it's sort of a confirmation and conformation biases that runs the system. And we see this in corporations too, right? So if you run an agent-based simulation of some sort in a system where you have some slight bias toward people who are like you,
Yeah.
very, very quickly, that system gets into a position that there is nobody unlike you. in the whole system. And I don't know much about how universities are run, but we clearly see this in companies. So it's sort of in the same vein, I think, right? In universities.
Oh, yes, it's very similar. Let me give you a historical example that I myself find telling. Um, in academic life, because people are very highly educated, to be on the faculty of a university, you ordinarily these days need a doctoral degree, which means you have spent 4 years as an undergraduate. You've probably done 2 years to get a master's degree preparatory to the PhD, and then at least 3 years for the PhD. So
Mhm.
you've been in the educational system for a very long time, K to 12, and then what? Uh, 8 more years
Yeah.
minimum toward getting your graduate degrees. And there's a temptation to think that since we are very, very well educated, especially by comparison to the general population, that we're probably right about things and not
Yeah.
very likely to be wrong about things. And we tend to think that if we have a certain view, given that we're very highly educated people, that view is probably right.
Yes.
And yet, if we think about some historical examples, and I'm going to get to the one that I have in mind, there's a real cautionary lesson here.
Mm,
And that is that very, very smart, very, very highly educated people, good people, people who are well intentioned, can
mm,
nevertheless embrace profoundly false and damaging ideologies.
mm.
The example I'm citing is the history of eugenics.
Well, yeah.
Now, when we think of eugenics today, we think of the Nazis.
Yeah.
And of course, the Nazis went for eugenics in a very big way
Mm,
and did so much evil in the name of eugenics. But it's important for us to recognize that the Nazis did not invent it. It wasn't invented by ill-educated thugs. It was invented and promoted and embraced prior to the rise of the Nazis
mm,
by well-educated, highly sophisticated,
mm.
well-intentioned people in Europe and in the United States. The Nazis got it from the great and the what we sometimes call the great and the good, the highly educated, sophisticated leadership class in the West,
Yeah.
progressive people, forward-thinking people who fell into the grip of this ideology. They couldn't imagine why anybody would oppose
Mm,
trying to improve the human race. Why would anybody oppose that? Therefore, if we can use technology and technique, technical skill to breed a better human being and to try to weed out the inferior human beings, if we're sophisticated people, if we're well-intentioned people, of course we want to do that. So eugenics was embraced by the greatest thinkers. It was the dominant position at all the great universities and the philanthropies, the great foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Harvard University, Princeton University. Um, Everybody thinking this is a great idea and looking down on and even condemning as anti-scientific the
Mm,
small number of people who resisted eugenics.
yeah.
Some of the people who resisted eugenics were religious people like the Catholic Church. And the sophisticated people who embraced eugenics would accuse these religious people of being fundamentalists and they're backward and they're anti-science and remember Galileo and all that. Well,
Yeah.
it turned out that the unsophisticated people were right
Right.
and the sophisticated, well-educated people were wrong. But they didn't realize that until the Nazi era gave eugenics a bad name, discredited eugenics. Then, after that, all the people who had embraced it wanted to wipe the historical record clean
Mm.
and forget that they had been the very ones who had embraced eugenics. You don't hear very much
Yeah.
about who did embrace eugenics, but it wasn't the backward people, the hillbillies, the hicks, the rubes. It was
Yeah.
the sophisticated, well-educated people at Harvard and Princeton.
Yeah. Lot of things are going through my mind, Robert. So, I was thinking, so when science advances and you say this is technically correct, do they have an obligation to look forward, to look at all the implications
Oh
of the
my, yes.
findings? I'm thinking nuclear fission. Einstein was really worried about that.
Exactly.
Uh, um, so what should scientists do? What should an academic institution do?
Well, um, Scientists should not take the following position, as attractive as it might be. The position they should not take is this: we're just scientists. We're not experts on ethics. We're experts on science. There are other people who are experts on ethics. We're going to leave the ethics to them.
Okay.
We as experts on science are just going to do the science and advance the science as far as we can take it in biotechnology or in physics or whatever it is. And then we will hand things over to the ethicists to say whether we should do this or that or the other thing. That's a model of the world that I think is a very bad mistake. We all have to face the ethical questions of whatever we're doing, wherever we're doing it, at every step of the way. Now, often those questions are not going to be, the answers to those questions are not going to be clear. And we're going to have to do the best we can. And because we're frail, fallible, fallen human beings, we're going to make some mistakes. And those mistakes might be tragic, like embracing eugenics. It turned out to be a tragic, tragic mistake. But we're going to have to do our best and not imagine that it's a matter for somebody else or it's a matter for ethical experts or philosophers. When it comes to dealing with the question, should I be conducting this scientific experiment or is it unethical for me to do that? The only expert is you and me who are doing the experiment. There's the person doing the experiment. He's got to think for himself. She's got to think for herself. She can't just hand it off to the experts. Now, it's good to learn what we can from academic debates about, say, bioethics. Listen to the philosophers, listen to the theologians, listen to people who work in this field. But we can't hand things over to them and wait for them to bless it. We're going to have to think for ourselves about those questions, which is another good reason, Gill, for us as we're educating our scientific class, our experts in science and the STEM subjects, to make sure that they have some time to reflect on those great questions of meaning and value. They should study some philosophy. They should study some literature. They should study some history. They should know the history of eugenics. I want every scientist to know the history of eugenics because there is so much to be learned from the mistakes that were made. I want every scientist to think about what it means to live a human life. Because we need to, that's what we have to bear in mind when we're thinking about, well, should we create some new method of procreation, for example, that dismisses the body altogether, or whatever we're going to do. I think that the temptation for people in the sciences to think that that's somebody else's business, but it's not somebody else's business.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Robert. So it goes back to liberal education. So you could get, maybe educate students to be more, I don't know what the right term, well-rounded, because they have, sort of different types of information. But I would have thought, without knowing anything about how universities function, I would have thought universities are sort of a natural place where disciplines could be integrated and debated and, get to a better position. That's not the case.
Yeah, well, there's good news and there's bad news, and there's a lot of bad news about academic life today. But let me at least give a little bit of good news. I think it's good that the old, and from my perspective, artificial boundaries between the disciplines have eroded. So that we don't have what we used to have, which was very narrow silos. This is physics, this is chemistry, this is biology, this is history, this is philosophy, this is literature. That I think was bad. It was a mistake. There was great work done in those disciplines, no question, don't get me wrong. But I think it's better that we have dialogue and interaction and even co-teaching across the disciplines. There are courses today at lots of universities, including mine, where you have a physicist in the room and a philosopher. I think that's great. Now, there's a danger there too. Sometimes they'll just divide up the class. You do the physics, I do the philosophy, and they won't actually engage. So
Yeah.
they're running on parallel tracks, but they're not actually engaging.
Yeah.
But in the where it's successful, you see the physicist and the philosopher engaging each other in a serious way. Same, for example, like the the biologist
Yeah.
and perhaps the person from religious studies. They've got a lot to talk about. And
Yeah.
students observing and listening to the two of them interacting, I think, can only be beneficial for the students' education. And you can think of that with lots of other disciplines.
Mhm.
So I'm glad that we are no longer strictly demarcating the disciplines the way we used to.
Yeah. Yeah, physics and philosophy is interesting, Robert. So, physics as opposed to quantum mechanics have had some struggles,
Yes.
including string theory. And they're basically, trying to look for something else to sort of try to put it all together. And philosophy is there, So I see a lot of physicists now very, very interested in philosophy, which never used to be the case, I think, right? I don't know the history.
Yes, I mean, there have always been, physics always has had a tendency to make people at the end of the day think about philosophical questions.
Hmm.
But that's at the end of the day. It's not part of the ordinary reflections of the working physicist, whether the physicist is a theoretical physicist or an experimental physicist. But I think actually having more interaction with philosophers is good for physics, and I
Yeah.
think that having more interaction with physicists and other scientists is good for philosophy. It's good for religion. I think it's good for historians. I think it's good for literature scholars.
Absolutely. So I want to go into another bucket of topics.
Yeah.
So this is an article you wrote. Universities should not be ideological churches, and you say here after the Supreme Court of the United States handed down its decision in Dobbs versus Jackson, Women's Health Organization early last summer, Princeton University's program in gender and sexuality studies issued a statement fiercely condemning the ruling. The director stated that the program stood in solidarity with the people whose rights had been allegedly stripped away by five conservative justices doing the racist and sexist bidding of the Christian right, causing women to endure forced pregnancies and waging an unprecedented attack on democracy. So I'll put my cards on the table, Robert. So I'm an agnostic and an independent, so I don't really have any specific view on this. But I've been reading, news and information, and clearly it seemed to have set the country into two corners of the room. Half the population is on one corner, the other half on the other corner. So it has been a very polarizing effect on the society, right? What happened in
Mhm.
Dobbs.
Yeah, I think it has further advanced the polarization that we previously had. The polarization on that issue began when the Supreme Court handed down the decision in 1973 that it reversed in the Dobbs decision. So the Supreme Court has been at the heart on both sides of the issue of the polarization. But my objection to that statement by the Gender and Sexuality program um, was not fundamentally about which side is right. I have my views about which side is right. I'm well published on the question of which side is right on the abortion question and the question of whether the Constitution says anything, and if so, what about abortion. My objection was to a university department or unit adopting an official orthodoxy as if it were a religion, as if it were a church, on a question on which reasonable people of goodwill in our society and lots of other societies disagree. I mean, I'm assuming if reasonable people of goodwill in a given society at a given point disagree, at least at that point, it's something of a difficult question. And if it's a difficult question, the role of the university is to provide a forum for the intelligent
Yeah.
debating of that question. It's not to establish a dogma, which is then enforced against dissenters. So that almost comical comically ideological statement that you just read is bad, in my opinion, not only because it was comical, but because it undermined the precious value of academic freedom by establishing for that department an orthodoxy. That means that if you are an applicant for a job in that department, then you are being sent a signal that there is no home for you here, no matter how good your work is, unless you toe our line when it comes to the question of abortion or the Dobbs decision. Same for a student considering, should I major in the gender and sexuality department? Well, what if the student happens to be pro-life? That student is going to think, well, there's no home for me here because I don't subscribe to that item of the catechism of the sexuality and gender studies department. It's for people who have a different ideological point of view. No department in any university should be only for people of one ideological point of view. Every department in every university should be a place that is perfectly suitable and welcoming to people who are across the spectrum when it comes to the debates about these questions among reasonable people of goodwill. I mean,
Yeah, so
to give you another example, this
yeah,
debate over
sure.
the Middle East. Now, you have departments in universities all over the country putting out statements. Most of the statements condemn Israel. Now, you can argue for Israel. You can argue for the Palestinian position. You can argue that both sides are at fault. You can argue any position you want. But I don't see why Princeton or Northwestern or Williams or Kansas State should have a foreign policy. They should be institutions where people who have different perspectives and different ideas and different policy prescriptions, different beliefs about the Middle East should be able to have intelligent, civil, but robust conversations about those issues.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah,
when it
so
comes, I mean, if the university were a church, since a church is composed of people who agree on a set of doctrines,
yeah.
it's fine with me for different churches to have catechisms. If you're Catholic, you subscribe to the Catholic catechism. If you're Lutheran, you subscribe to the Lutheran catechism. If you're Lutheran and decide that you like the doctrines of the Catholic catechism better, you think they're more likely true, then you simply switch and you convert and you move from being Lutheran to being Catholic. And all that is fine. But a university shouldn't be a church. The Department of Physics shouldn't be a church. The Department of Sexuality and Gender Studies or of Philosophy should not be a church. It should not have a catechism. It should not have dogmas.
Yeah, but there are two questions here. So I just want to get clarity on this. So there is a question of ideology. So one could say a university department should not have an ideology. And there's a more practical question, which is, should they put out something to the public about their ideology? So in the former, it's very difficult. I don't know, again, I don't know how universities work. So let's say I have 100 faculty members and they're sort of split 50-50 and they have a democratic means to come to some conclusion. They probably have a bias, right? It's nearly impossible to have not to have an ideological bias in the department, I would think, right?
Well, uh, unless you have a tie, there will be one side that has more supporters than the other side. But my point is that universities and university departments should not be taking positions at
Yeah.
all on those things. They should be providing an impartial forum for debating these issues. Now, it would be different. Some of our universities are religiously affiliated. They're in a different situation. Notre Dame is Catholic. Brigham Young University is Latter-day Saints, Mormon. Yeshiva University is Jewish. We have a Muslim university in California, Zaytuna College. Baylor University is Baptist. We have these different, and for those institutions, I have no objection to them embracing or endorsing positions that are in line with their religion. But all state universities are forbidden from being religiously sectarian. And many other universities, including my university, Princeton or Northwestern and University of Chicago, where you were in university, those universities have decided to be non-sectarian. So if you've decided to be non-sectarian, then your obligation really is to provide that impartial forum It's not to take positions on these kinds of disputed issues.
Mm.
I
And
think
I
it
think,
can only do harm to the truth-seeking mission of the university for the university to allow itself to become, as I say in that article, an ideological church.
yeah, yeah,
Universities should be less about giving you answers
yeah,
than debating questions. And
debating
this is what
questions.
I
Yeah,
mean, this is the truth in the old axiom, and you've probably heard it, the old aphorism, really, that we as university professors should not be telling students what to think. We should be teaching students how to think. That is
how to think.
absolutely true. That is
Yeah,
absolutely true. It's not my job to get my student, and it's not my right to
yeah,
make my student think as I think, whether it's about abortion, Israel and Palestine, anything else. It's my job to help that student, nurture that student to think more deeply, more
yeah,
critically, including self-critically, always self-critically, and to
yeah.
think for himself. If he reaches a different conclusion from mine, that's great, fine, God bless him. He has no obligation to agree with me.
Mm.
I don't want to know, I don't look at a student and say, okay, he's reached an opinion different from mine, I've failed. I rather say, I look at the student and say, he's reached his own opinion after reflection on the
Mm.
best arguments available to him, which I made sure in the readings to present him.
Yeah.
And it's a success. I've won. It's a big success. I've done my job.
Yeah, so it's more about the process than content.
Yeah.
I'm fond of saying, if you need content, just Google it. There's no,
Yeah.
there's really no need
These
to
days.
uh, study
Yeah.
content anymore. But the process is quite important still, which is sort of a thinking process. So almost all education really should be focused on how to think, right? That's what I'm hearing.
Well, exactly right. Um, it's 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 both skills and virtues. The skills are things like critical thinking.
Yeah.
That's something that you can be trained to do. You can be trained to be a critical thinker. I was trained in a tradition called analytic philosophy when I was a graduate student in Oxford. It was a tradition that puts a tremendous amount of emphasis on precise, logically rigorous
Hmm.
thinking. And that's been very helpful to me in my whole life, not just in my professional philosophical work, but in my whole life. So I think those skills it's very important to impart. But then there are certain virtues, Gil,
Hmm.
and these have to be imparted in a more subtle way and mainly by example. And those virtues are things like love of truth, being willing to put the truth above other things, getting ahead,
Yeah.
getting your side a victory, your tribe a victory. You got to make truth number one. All those other things have to be put in secondary position. Another virtue, very important, humility, intellectual humility.
Hmm.
If you lack intellectual humility, you will never allow yourself to be challenged because you will assume you're already right about everything.
Yeah.
You will lose your sense of your fallibility. And then a third very important virtue we have to encourage in our students. And again, it's mainly taught by example. You can't just preach it. And
Hmm.
that is the virtue of courage. That is the willingness to state an opinion when you sincerely believe it, even if it's unpopular, even if it's
Hmm.
going to make you enemies, even if people are going to ridicule you or
Hmm.
despise you. If we're genuine lovers of truth, we need to have the courage to speak the truth as best we understand the truth, knowing that we're fallible, knowing that we can be wrong, but
Hmm.
nevertheless willing to stand up for what we have come to believe is true.
Hmm. So I want to tell you a funny story, Robert. So I know that you're a practicing Catholic. I grew up in a fairly traditional Catholic family in South India.
Oh, South
Uh,
India, yeah.
yeah, so it's a pretty small part of the India's population. And I was an altar boy and all of that. And then when I was about 10 or 11, and you will appreciate this since you went to Oxford, they started playing cricket on Sundays. And I said, I'm going to leave the church.
Well, that's the best excuse I think I've ever heard. That's an honorable excuse.
And I haven't returned since then. So, so this axis of religion and logic and all of that, right? I mean, universities. So this goes back to the bias question again. I suspect universities have a lot of atheists, agnostics, and so on, right? So um, if you have a concentration of them, then all the policies will be in that vein, right? I mean, you can't really get away from it.
Well, no, I have colleagues who are atheists who are very fair and recognize that religious points of view have a impressive history. Um, some of the greatest thinkers of all of history have been religious people in the sciences as well as in philosophy and the arts disciplines. They want religious voices to be heard, even though their own particular voice is not a religious voice. I feel the same way about atheists. I myself am a believer, as you say, a Catholic, but I want my students to be exposed to the best thinking among people who are secular or who don't believe in God or don't have a religious sensibility or affiliation, because I think there's so much to be learned. I mean, knowledge is not uh, uh, distributed only to people of one perspective, whether it's on matters of religion or philosophy or anything else. Knowledge is really quite widely distributed. So is
Yeah.
intelligence, very widely distributed. Insight, very widely distributed. So, I mean, I have learned so much from uh, people whose religious beliefs are different from mine, from Protestants, although I'm Catholic. I've learned an enormous amount from Jewish teachers.
Mm,
Uh, Two of my people I count as my greatest mentors, Rabbi David Novak at the University of Toronto, and my late beloved and much missed friend, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs from Britain. I've learned an enormous amount from these men. I've learned from Muslims, like my friend Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. I've learned from friends who are atheists or agnostics.
mm.
Um, we all have so much to learn from each other. We shouldn't suppose that just because a person is this religion or just because this person is an atheist, they don't know anything or they're ignorant or they're foolish.
Yeah.
That seems to me to be a very bad position to take.
Mm. It's a tool. So you should use all the tools available to you to reach the right conclusion, some ways, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, religions themselves are great treasuries of wisdom. Not that religions have always been right about everything. Obviously,
Mm.
religions have been wrong about very important things because religions are made up of human beings too. And we're frail and fallible and fallen human beings. We can get things wrong. But there's great wisdom. I studied the Buddhist tradition, the Theravada Buddhist tradition, when I was a student with a great monk. He was the abbot of the monastery in Chiang Mai, Thailand. His title
Yeah.
was Zhao Kun. He was Zhao Kun Rajavar Muni. And I mean, here I am, a Christian, studying at the feet of this very learned Buddhist and drinking in wisdom from his tradition.
Mm,
It did not undermine my faith in the slightest to
mm,
learn from what his tradition had to teach.
mm,
The same as I say with Rabbi Novak and Rabbi Sachs. It's not that I lost my faith. Quite the
mm,
contrary. I mean,
mm.
they enriched and deepened my faith. In the case of course a Christian person like myself studying with great Jewish thinkers, you're learning from what Pope John Paul II called our elder brothers. Uh, the,
Mm.
this is the mother faith from which Christianity came, and Christians would do very well to appreciate more deeply than they do their
Yeah.
Jewish heritage, the roots of their religion in the Jewish witness.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about sort of debates. I grew up debating. Debating is sort of a lost art, it seems to
Mm.
me, in the US. We have shouting matches, but they're not necessarily debates. And so I want to touch back on this political philosophy sort of area. So we are in the throes of the election cycle in the US. Um, and it seems like most people I talk to, they have made their decisions one way or the other. It seems binary in many ways, with no chance of considering an alternative proposal or idea or anything like that. And so, have we lost the ability to debate altogether in the US? Where are we?
We've largely lost it, and here I want to make a statement. I've not had an opportunity publicly to make this one before. There are some people who say, "Oh, don't glamorize the past. Things were always bad. People
Hmm,
never really knew how to debate in a civil manner. Debates were always shouting matches. It was always manipulation. Nothing has really changed. It's not any worse than it used to be. It is worse than it used to be.
It
You know,
is, yeah.
study the interactions, for example, of two great political opponents in Britain in the 19th century, Gladstone and Disraeli.
Hmm.
They debated pretty fiercely,
Hmm.
but not in a way that was simply a shouting match. These were men who engaged each other, engaged each other's arguments. Anybody listening to those debates, no matter which side you were on, would learn from those
Hmm.
debates. Go back and read. We have transcriptions. They're not perfect
Hmm.
transcriptions. They were taken down by journalists who were listening. But we have transcriptions of the Lincoln and Douglas debate. Stephen Douglas against Abraham Lincoln in the Senate contest in 1858 in the Illinois territory. Um, those were learned men debating. Today, we all think Lincoln won the debate. We identify with
Hmm.
Lincoln, not with Douglas. But Douglas was not an idiot. He was not a fool. He didn't spend all his time shouting at Lincoln. Quite the contrary. He made arguments, and Lincoln answered those arguments, and Lincoln made arguments, and Douglas did his best to answer those arguments. Those were serious debates. I sometimes watch C-SPAN. I'm that kind of person who watches C-SPAN. And on
Yeah.
C-SPAN, about a year ago or so, maybe a little more, they aired an old debate between John F. Kennedy
Hmm.
and not Richard Nixon. That's the famous debate.
Hmm.
No, it was between John F. Kennedy and Hubert H. Humphrey
Oh, wow.
when they
Okay.
were contending with each other
Yeah.
for the Democratic nomination to seek the presidency in
Hmm.
1960.
Hmm.
And the debate was being conducted by journalists. It was filmed, but it was being conducted by journalists in my home state of West Virginia, where I was born and brought up.
Yeah, yeah.
And the journalists, they were newspapermen, were asking the two candidates questions, and the two candidates were engaging each other on those questions. It was a wonderful thing to watch.
Hmm.
They debated tax policy. They debated labor issues.
Hmm.
They debated how to deal with the Soviet Union, and they agreed on some things, but they also disagreed on some things. And they did not shout at each other. They did
Hmm.
not use manipulative rhetoric. They did not grandstand. They made intelligent points. They engaged each other in a serious way. So, having seen that with my own eyes
Hmm.
via the magic of television and C-SPAN,
Hmm.
nobody can tell me that, oh, it's always been this way. People
Yeah.
always shout at each other. We've never had an era where people knew how to debate intelligently and in a civil
Hmm.
manner. We did, and we need to recover it. My beloved friend Cornel West and I tried to do this together.
Yeah.
Cornel, who's running for president himself right now, is very much on the left. I'm on the conservative side. When he was teaching at Princeton, we taught together for several years. We did our seminars together. Since he left, we've gone around the country at every opportunity we can, lecturing at universities, uh, just about everywhere. And so we try to model the
Hmm.
kind of civil engagement between people who disagree
Hmm.
that we would now like to see become the norm, or at least more
Is
common.
Yeah, is there a course, debate 101 or something at Princeton? Yeah, I mean, if there isn't, should there be one? I mean, should there be a course on how to
No,
debate?
I don't think
No.
so. I don't think that's the way to go. I think what students need is they need to see people doing it.
Hmm.
And ideally, this is expensive, and most universities, I think, for financial reasons, can't do it. Ideally, you'd put two professors who represent different perspectives,
Yeah.
perhaps different disciplines, perhaps not. You could have two economists or two political scientists or two philosophers. It wouldn't matter what their disciplines were, but two intelligent, well-informed, well-educated people who disagree,
Yeah.
engage each other, and doing so with the students on the basis of some common readings.
Yeah.
So for example, let's say we got a couple of economists, one from the more on the left, one from more on the conservative side. And we have the students, let's have 20 students in a seminar. We're going to discuss all together. Let's have them read Marx and let's have them read Hayek. So we got a common base of reading. So people
Yeah.
have to do some work here. And then the two professors can engage.
Yeah. I love it.
And the
Yeah.
one on the left will critique Hayek, and the one on the right will critique Marx, and the students will listen, having read the texts,
Yeah.
and the students will learn. And I don't care which way they come out. I mean, I have my views on this. I'm more sympathetic to Hayek than I am to Marx.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to consider it a victory if 15 come out on the side of Hayek and 5 come out on the side of Marx. I'm going to consider it a victory if 20 of them reach their own conclusions based on informed judgment as
Yeah.
to where the truth of the matter is.
Yeah, I mean, so education is sort of going through a redesign process. So, I look at Norway, Finland, I look at some Scandinavian countries. They're basically saying there is no point in this physics 101, chemistry 102 stuff. Let the students sort of design what they want to learn, because as administrators, we don't really know where the heck technology is heading. And so why have a very prescriptive education? You're wasting a lot of your time doing that. But it seems to me, I mean, I haven't been in education, Robert. It seems to me that we are still in a very prescriptive sort of a system, isn't it?
Well, we no longer have in most universities a core curriculum.
Okay.
A very small number have hung on to that. Columbia University has hung on to that, but we don't have one at Princeton, and we haven't had one for many, many years. And most universities don't have. Now, part of the reason for that is that there's just too much knowledge to include.
Yeah.
You have to make choices. But I guess I still, Gil, am clinging to the idea that every student, at least here in the West, should know enough about their own history
Mm.
and the history of their own culture, their own
Yeah.
backgrounds, that they'll know who Plato was.
Yeah.
They'll know who Saint
Yeah.
Augustine was and what he believed. They'll know something about the Renaissance
Mm.
and the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Um, they'll know something about the Bible. You,
Yeah.
you, you can't read Shakespeare and
Mm.
understand what he's talking about if you know nothing about the Bible.
Mm.
So if we want our students to appreciate the glories of Shakespeare,
Yeah.
there's some preconditions there. There's some things that they
Mm.
need to know. And by the way, while we're on the subject of Shakespeare, it would be a good thing if every student at some point, either in high school or college, at least read one Shakespeare play. It's the
Yeah.
patrimony of these students. It doesn't matter where they come from. My
Yeah.
ancestors came from Syria and Lebanon. Yours came from South India. My
Yeah.
students have backgrounds from China and Korea and Ghana and Ecuador and all these places. No matter where they
Yeah.
came from, if they're here in the United States, if this is where their families are now making their lives, then
Yeah.
Shakespeare belongs to them as much as to anybody else. Plato belongs to them. Augustine
Yeah.
belongs to them. They should know something about these great thinkers and these great achievements. Same when it comes to science, by the way. They
Mm.
should know who Kepler is, right? They should have some idea of Einstein more than that he had wild hair.
Yeah, I was going in the other direction, Robert. I'm not convinced about this. I was arguing that why study Newtonian mechanics? Why study even theory of relativity? Because quantum mechanics drives everything. So physics 101 should start in quantum mechanics. Just forget everything else before that.
No, we have to.
The-
I don't agree with that. I think we have to know how we got to where we are.
Yeah, but as you say, there's sort of a knowledge quantity issue in education.
Yes, I agree with that.
Um, and so there are some trade-offs that one has to make in education, right? Because it's nearly
Great.
impossible to get to some level of specialty in any subject, uh, without starting sort of midway, in some
Yeah.
sense. I wonder. I mean, I haven't really thought about this. Yeah.
No, I'm sympathetic to that. I understand that. That's why I said in relation to the core curriculum, it's understandable that we no longer have the core. It's not just that, some wild progressive thinker came in and did away with the core curriculum, or people who are opposed to Western tradition or, what have you. It's that there's so much to include, and you can't include it all, so you have to make choices. I mean, do we include Hawthorne or not? If we're going to have a core curriculum, do we include Jane Austen or not? Do we include George Eliot or not? Do we
Yeah.
include Maimonides or Aquinas or not? Your choices have to be made if you're
And I
going to do
remember,
it that way.
yeah, I remember you saying in one of your talks that as you sort of look at your students over a period of time, they seem to be less able to read quantity
Oh, yes.
anymore, right? So I know that social media is sort of eating into this a little bit. I wonder, the span of attention is eating into it. So you now have a different kind of a student than what you had 20 years ago, right? Is that
There is one change. So in my courses, I, having been trained in Oxford in analytic philosophy, I put a very high premium on analytical rigor, logical precision, very careful thinking. I'm demanding of my students. Not because I'm a mean person, I hope I'm not a mean person, but because I want them
they
to
may have a
learn.
different opinion on
They
that,
might
right?
have a different opinion, yes, but I want them to learn and I want to impart to them these skills that, and for me, have been enormously valuable. So I'm demanding. I also grade to a very rigorous standard. I have not given in to the grade inflation thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I have retained those principles, rigor, rigorous grading. But there is one area in which I have been forced to yield,
Hmm.
and that is in the quantity of reading that I assign.
Hmm.
20 years ago, I could assign a very large volume of reading, and I could count on my students to do it.
Yeah.
Sometimes 150 pages to prepare for a class. I have found in the last 5 to 10 years,
Hmm.
I can no longer do this. Students will not do it. And it's not that they are intransigent.
Hmm.
Even my best students, every bit as good as the students I've had in the past, if they're required to do that much or asked to do that much reading, they will not do it. And I've reached the conclusion, Gil, that they will not do it because they cannot do it. It's not that they're being stubborn or lazy.
Yeah, yeah.
It's that the attention span has shortened. They can't stick with it. The text cannot hold their attention the way for a previous generation of students they could consistently, sit down there for 3 hours and work through this material and then take a break and then do 2 more hours. And when I realized that even my best students weren't able to do the reading I was assigning, all the reading I was assigning, I realized that um, the attention span is shortened, and I'm just going to have to yield on this. And so I no longer
Hmm.
assign that volume of reading. I'm sorry about that, but we do the best we can. Now, there is the question you raised a minute ago: what caused this shortening of the attention span?
Yeah.
I have not studied the question myself. My friend Jonathan Haidt, the great social psychologist at New York University, he argues that screens and devices have had this effect on our
Hmm.
children's students' minds. He might very well be right about that. As I say, I'm not myself someone who studied it, but I don't know. He certainly makes a powerful argument.
Hmm.
But whatever it is that is behind it, it's a phenomenon. It's a reality. It has
Hmm.
happened, and we're just going to have to deal with it.
Yeah, there's clearly something going on. So yeah, it's really tough to tease out. And so the two trends, the quantity of knowledge or information is increasing, but the human's ability to sort of dig into it apparently is
Yeah,
decreasing.
yeah.
This is a prescription for disaster if you sort of move time forward, right? I wonder,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we're just going to have to adjust our teaching methods. Now, Jonathan, very strongly argues. Jonathan Haidt very strongly argues that we shouldn't simply give up here. That we should revise our parenting and
Hmm.
our teaching for the K-12. We should not allow, as parents, we should not allow our young our children to have screens. They can have flip phones, but not cell phones, not laptops, until they're 16 or perhaps 18. That these should not be allowed in schools, even if parents allow their children to have these devices at home. ban them as far as school's concerned. So they're spending, 7 hours a day or 8 hours a day or however long they're in school without the screens. And it might be that for a generation that's brought up by adherence to those rules, the attention span would be longer and better. I don't know.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Robert. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Oh, it's my very great pleasure, Gil. Thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you.